The hunger of Solo Hill. The rain slammed against the windshield as Emily sped down the winding forest road, tires spinning against the slick pavement. Trees leaned in on either side of her car like mourners over an open casket. The headlights barely pierced the fog, their beams swallowed whole by the dense mist. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles as pale as bone. You can't run forever. The thought had haunted her for miles. She couldn't shake it, no matter how fast she drove or how far she went. The truth followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Her breath hitched as she checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the silhouette of the manor rising behind her. But the road remained empty. The locket pulsed faintly in the passenger seat, glowing like a dying ember beneath the rain-soaked bag she had thrown over it. She didn't want to touch it. She didn't even want to look at it, but she could feel its heat through the fabric, radiating like a fever. She should have destroyed it when she had the chance. The rain thickened, drowning out the rhythmic thud of her heart. Just keep driving. Just get to the next town. She would find a motel, maybe call her mother, pretend she could go back to a life where shadows didn't follow her and whispers didn't crawl into her ears at night. But then the engine sputtered. Her breath caught. No, come on. The car shuddered, coughed like an asthmatic on their last breath, and then died altogether, the lights cutting out in an instant. The night devoured her, leaving her stranded in the dark. The only sound was the rain pounding on the roof and her own ragged breathing. She sat there for a moment, trembling. Rainwater blurred the windshield, distorting the outline of the trees beyond. The forest swayed in the storm like it was alive. Her fingers fumbled with the keys, twisting them in the ignition. The engine whined but didn't catch. A soft knock on the passenger side window made her scream. Her head snapped to the right. Someone was standing there, barely visible through the rain. A man soaked and disheveled, with dark hair plastered to his face. His eyes were wide, his breath fogging the glass as he leaned closer and knocked again, harder this time. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. "Oh!" The man shouted something, but the rain drowned out his voice. He motioned for her to lower the window. Her fingers hovered over the control, trembling. Every instinct told her to drive away, but the car was dead, and she was alone. Swallowing her fear, she cracked the window an inch. Cold rain splashed against her face. "What do you want?" "I saw your car break down," the man said, his voice muffled. "I have a cabin not far from here. You shouldn't be out here in this storm. The road floods fast." Emily didn't answer. She scanned his face, looking for something, anything, off. But he just looked cold and tired, like he'd been caught in the rain for hours. "You can wait out the storm," he added. "There's a landline at the cabin. You can call for help." Her chest tightened. She wanted to say no, to lock the doors and wait out the night in the car. But the idea of being trapped here, with the locket pulsing beside her, was unbearable. She needed to be somewhere with walls, a roof, warmth. "Okay," she whispered. The forest was suffocating, the trees pressing in on them as they trudged along the muddy path. Rain soaked through Emily's jacket, and her boots sank into the muck with every step. The man, Ryan, he had said his name was, walked ahead, his flashlight cutting weakly through the fog. Not much farther, he called over his shoulder, his breath clouding the air. Emily followed in silence, clutching her bag close to her chest. The locket inside it burned like a brand against her skin, but she didn't dare take it out. She kept her eyes on Ryan's back, watching the way he moved, listening for any change in his tone or step that might signal danger. The cabin emerged from the mist like a ghost ship, its slanted roof and boarded windows giving it the appearance of something abandoned long ago. But smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and light flickered faintly through the cracks in the shutters. Ryan unlocked the door and pushed it open. Warm air rushed out, carrying the scent of burning wood and something savory, stew maybe. Emily hesitated on the threshold, her gaze darting around the dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves of old books and hunting trophies, and a fire crackled in the stone hearth. "It's not much," Ryan said, dropping his wet coat onto a chair by the door. "But it's dry. You can warm up by the fire." Emily stepped inside, her boots squelching against the wooden floor. She didn't take off her coat. She didn't let go of her bag. Ryan stirred the pot of stew on the stove, his back to her. "You hungry?" Her stomach churned, but she shook her head. "No, thanks." He nodded, ladling some stew into a bowl for himself before sitting at the table. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the occasional clink of Ryan's spoon against the bowl. Emily sat in the armchair closest to the fire, her gaze never leaving him. The heat seeped into her bones, but it did little to ease the knot of tension in her chest. The locket pulsed faintly inside her bag, and she clenched her hands into fists to stop them from shaking. "You seem on edge," Ryan said, setting his empty bowl aside. "Long day?" "You could say that." He studied her for a moment, his eyes flicking to the bag in her lap. "What's in there that's got you so spooked?" Her breath hitched. "Nothing." He smiled faintly, but there was something off about it, too wide, too knowing. "You've been running from something, haven't you?" Emily's pulse quickened. "Why do you care?" Ryan leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the table. "People don't end up on this road by accident. They're either lost or they're running, and you don't look lost." She stood abruptly, backing toward the door. "I should go." Ryan's smile faded. "It won't let you leave, you know." His voice was softer now, almost sympathetic. "Whatever you're running from, it'll follow you. The woods don't end here. They twist, turn, lead you right back to where you started." Her back hit the door. She fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "I can help you," Ryan said, standing slowly. His eyes darkened, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "But you have to let me in." The floorboards groaned beneath her feet. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, stretching toward her like reaching hands. She clutched her bag tighter, her breath coming in panicked gasps. "You brought it with you," Ryan continued, stepping closer. His skin seemed to shimmer, like something was crawling just beneath the surface. "It's inside you now." "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're lying." Ryan's face twisted, his mouth stretching too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. His eyes turned black, voids that reflected nothing but hunger. "You can't run from it, Emily. You belong to it now." Screaming, she yanked the locket from her bag and held it up like a shield. The heat scorched her palm, but she didn't care. The room shook, the fire flaring violently as shadows writhed and hissed. Ryan lunged at her, but the locket blazed with light, and he recoiled, shrieking as his body convulsed and twisted. The walls groaned, splitting open like wounds as darkness poured from the cracks. Emily didn't wait to see what happened next. She threw open the door. This time it yielded, and sprinted into the rain, her boots splashing through puddles as the whispers chased her into the night. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Her fingers fumbled with the keys, her breath ragged as she yanked open the door and threw herself inside. The engine sputtered to life, and she floored the gas, the tires spinning before catching traction. As she sped down the road, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Ryan stood at the edge of the forest, his black eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers followed her, coiling around her mind like smoke. But this time, they weren't just coming from the woods. They were coming from inside her head. The road to madness. The rain lashed against the car's windows like a storm of needles, each drop slicing through the thin barrier between Emily and the nightmare outside. Her foot pressed hard against the gas pedal, the speedometer needle creeping higher as the forest blurred into a smear of black and green. The road twisted beneath her tires like the coils of a snake, winding endlessly, as if trying to strangle her with every turn. She wiped her damp, trembling hands on her jeans, glancing at the rearview mirror every few seconds. Nothing followed her, at least nothing she could see, but the absence of a visible threat did nothing to calm her. The shadows lived in her now. She could feel them, wriggling, whispering, crawling through her veins like insects beneath her skin. A sick laugh escaped her lips. "You're losing it," she muttered to herself. The sound of her own voice felt foreign, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. "You've officially lost it." The locket sat on the passenger seat, cold now, but its presence was suffocating. She wanted to throw it out the window, watch it sink into the muddy roadside ditch, and drive until the world itself forgot about it. But she knew it wouldn't be that simple. It would find its way back. It always did. Her phone buzzed from the cup holder, lighting up the dark interior of the car like a flare. She flinched, nearly swerving off the road. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she grabbed the phone and looked at the screen. Unknown number. "You're running, but you won't get far." Her fingers clenched around the phone, her nails digging into its casing. She wanted to scream, to hurl it out the window just like the locket, but her thumb hovered over the message instead, her breath trembling as she reread it over and over. The words pulsed like a heartbeat. She forced herself to type back. "Emily, what do you want? Why won't you leave me alone?" Her hand trembled as she hit send. The rain seemed to grow louder, drowning out everything but her rapid breathing. She waited, heart pounding, for the response she knew was coming. It arrived within seconds. Unknown number. "I don't want you to run. I want you to come home." Home. The word twisted like a knife in her chest. The only home she had known these past few months was fear, paranoia, and the constant shadow of Solo Hill lingering over her. She could still feel the cold floor of the basement beneath her fingertips, hear the screams of the thing that had worn Daniel's face, and smell the decay that had seeped into the walls of that cursed house. She threw the phone onto the passenger seat, right next to the locket, and bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. "No," she whispered. "I'm not going back." The headlights illuminated a green road sign ahead, its letters dripping with rainwater. The sign marked the exit for Ridgewick, the town she had tried so hard to leave behind. Her stomach twisted violently, a wave of nausea rolling over her. She didn't want to be anywhere near this place. But the road seemed to be pulling her back, like the house itself had extended invisible roots into the asphalt. Her mind warred with itself. She could turn off, drive toward the nearest city, find a crowded diner where the whispers couldn't reach her. She could disappear. But a part of her, the part that still believed there was any chance of ending this, knew that running wasn't the answer. The answer was waiting for her, where it had always been. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the wheel and took the exit. The wheels splashed through puddles as she pulled into the parking lot of a roadside diner. The neon sign above the entrance flickered, casting ghostly shadows across the wet pavement. Mel's Diner, open 24 hours. Emily turned off the engine, but didn't get out immediately. She sat there, gripping the steering wheel as her breath fogged the window. The glow of the neon lights flickered in her peripheral vision, taunting her like a dying heartbeat. She knew what would happen if she stepped inside. The whispers would follow her, just as they had at the last diner, at the last motel, at the last place she thought she could hide. But sitting here in the car with the locket pulsing next to her was worse. She grabbed her bag, shoving the cursed object deep inside, and stepped into the rain. The downpour soaked through her jacket within seconds, plastering her hair to her face. The wind howled through the empty parking lot, carrying with it the faint smell of wet asphalt and something metallic, like blood. The bell above the diner door jingled as she entered. The warmth hit her like a wave, along with the smell of bacon grease and stale coffee. The place was nearly empty. A lone trucker sat at the counter, his head bent over a steaming mug of coffee, while a waitress with frizzy hair leaned against the register, flipping through a tabloid. "Sit wherever you like," the waitress said without looking up. Emily chose a booth near the window, her back pressed firmly against the seat so she could see the entrance. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the menu, the words swimming on the page. She wasn't hungry, but she needed to do something, anything, to distract herself from the weight of the locket digging into her side. The waitress shuffled over, pen poised above her notepad. "Coffee?" Emily nodded. "Yeah, black." The waitress scribbled it down and disappeared without another word. Emily exhaled shakily, her gaze drifting to the window. The rain smeared the view, turning the trees into shadowy blurs. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe she was just another traveler stopping for coffee on a rainy night. Then the lights flickered. Her breath hitched. She gripped the edge of the table, her nails digging into the worn laminate surface. The flickering stopped after a moment, but her heart didn't slow. She glanced around the diner. The trucker didn't seem to notice, and the waitress was busy pouring coffee behind the counter. "It's just the storm," she told herself. "Power lines. Nothing to be scared of." The bell above the door jingled. She turned instinctively, her pulse spiking, but there was no one there. The door hung open for a moment before slowly creaking shut, the wind howling as it did. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She hesitated before pulling it out, her fingers slick with sweat. "Unknown number. We see you." Her stomach dropped. She looked up, scanning the diner. The trucker was still at the counter, sipping his coffee. The waitress was wiping down a table. No one was looking at her, but she felt it, the unmistakable weight of a gaze, heavy and cold, pressing down on the back of her neck. Her fingers hovered over the screen, and she typed back, "Emily, what do you want?" The reply came almost instantly. "Unknown number. To bring you home." The lights flickered again, longer this time. The hum of the overhead bulbs pulsed in her ears, syncing with the racing beat of her heart. When the light stabilized, the air felt heavier, like the room itself was leaning in, listening. A shadow passed outside the window. Emily's breath hitched. She whipped her head around, but the rain obscured everything beyond the glass. The waitress returned with her coffee, setting it down without a word. The smell of the dark liquid made Emily's stomach churn. She pushed the cup away and grabbed her bag, the locket's cold weight pressing against her hip like a lead weight. She couldn't stay here. The bell jingled as she bolted from the booth and ran into the rain. Her boots splashed through puddles as she reached the car, yanked open the door, and threw herself inside. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she locked the doors and fumbled for the keys. The phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. "You can't leave. We're already inside." Tears blurred her vision. She dropped the phone onto the floor and slammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but the sound did nothing to quiet the screams building in her chest. The locket burned against her side. She pressed a hand to it, her fingers digging into the fabric of her bag as if she could crush it with sheer force. But it was too late. She could feel it spreading, the shadows worming their way into her bloodstream, planting themselves like seeds that would never die. As she sped down the highway, the whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with every mile. "Let me out, Emily." Her vision blurred, the road ahead twisting like a snake. She blinked rapidly, tears streaming down her face as the world around her dissolved into shadow. "Let me out." A laugh escaped her lips, wild, broken, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "You're already out," she whispered to the darkness. "Aren't you?" And this time the voice answered, "Yes." The house that won't die. The rain battered the windshield like fingers tapping urgently against the glass, each drop an impatient demand to stop running, to surrender. Emily's breath fogged up the interior as she gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her knuckles stiff and aching. The highway stretched endlessly before her, its slick surface reflecting ghostly smears of light from passing street lamps. She had no destination, just forward. Forward was safe. Forward kept the whispers at bay. Her phone buzzed again from the passenger seat, where the cursed locket rested inside her soaked bag like a heart waiting to beat again. She hadn't touched the phone since the last message, but the screen lit up repeatedly, glowing faintly through the damp fabric of the bag like the pulse of something alive. She wanted to throw it out the window and leave it to rot in the mud. But something deep down told her it wouldn't matter. It would always come back. It always found a way back. A soft chuckle escaped her lips, bitter and cracked. She was tired, so tired of the cycle. Running, hiding, listening to whispers. She wasn't sure how long she had been driving or if she had eaten or slept in the past 24 hours. Her body ached with exhaustion, her muscles cramping, but her mind wouldn't let her stop. It won't ever let me rest, will it? The lights of a gas station appeared on the horizon, dim and flickering like a dying star. She exhaled sharply and signaled toward the exit, her tires skidding slightly as she pulled into the station's empty lot. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting a sterile, flickering glow across the cracked pavement. Emily parked near one of the pumps and sat motionless for a moment, resting her forehead against the steering wheel. The rain continued to pelt the roof in a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Just 5 minutes, she thought. Just 5 minutes to breathe. She closed her eyes, but the moment her lids fluttered shut, the whispers returned. You can't rest, Emily. You can't stop. We're here. We've always been here. Her eyes snapped open, her pulse racing. Leave me alone, she shouted, her voice reverberating off the car's interior. Her own words sounded strange and hollow, like they belonged to someone else. The phone buzzed again, louder this time, persistent, demanding. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bag and pulled it onto her lap. The locket's cold metal pressed against her fingers, and she yanked her hand away as if it had burned her. The phone continued buzzing, vibrating against the fabric like an insect trapped inside. No, she whispered. No. But the buzzing didn't stop. Her breath came faster, her chest heaving. Finally, with a strangled sob, she unzipped the bag and pulled out the phone. The screen was slick with condensation, the glow from the notification burning into her eyes like a curse. Unnumber, it's time to come home. Emily's hands shook violently, and the phone slipped from her grasp, landing with a dull thud on the seat. The word home repeated over and over in her mind, each repetition digging deeper, like nails scratching across a blackboard. Her throat tightened, and a sob escaped her lips. Sallow Hill Manor was gone. She had watched it collapse, burned it to the ground. The flames had licked the walls, consumed the shadows, and devoured the whispers, or so she had thought. But the house wasn't dead. It had never been just a house. It had been waiting for her. With her hands trembling, she wiped her eyes and gripped the wheel again. The engine groaned as she turned the key, but it started on the second try. She pulled out of the gas station, back onto the empty highway, the locket pulsing faintly in her lap. She wasn't driving aimlessly anymore. She was going home. The road leading to Sallow Hill was overgrown with weeds and shrouded in mist, the trees crowding closer as if trying to warn her away. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle, but the air remained thick and heavy, clinging to her skin like a second layer. Her headlights barely cut through the fog, illuminating the twisted shapes of tree branches that reached across the road like skeletal arms. She hadn't been back since the night she'd set the house on fire. In her mind, she had buried it, sealed it away beneath ash and ruin. But as she rounded the final bend and the clearing came into view, her heart plummeted. Swallow Hill Manor stood tall, whole, and untouched by flames. The roof stretched upward like a jagged crown, the windows dark and empty, reflecting nothing but the mist swirling around the house. Vines coiled up the stone walls, pulsing faintly as though alive. The air felt colder here, sharper, biting at her exposed skin. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "This isn't real. I burned you." But the house didn't care about her denial. It loomed ahead, waiting like it always had. Her hands clenched the steering wheel until her fingers ached. She wanted to turn around, to drive as fast as she could, until the house was nothing more than a memory fading into the mist. But the locket burned against her thigh, reminding her that running had never been an option. With a final breath, she opened the car door and stepped into the rain. The ground squelched beneath her boots as she made her way toward the front steps, her bag clutched tightly against her chest. The air smelled of damp earth and something foul, like meat left to rot in the sun. The wooden door creaked as she pushed it open. The foyer was exactly as she remembered. The grand staircase stretching upward, its banister warped and splintered, the faded burgundy wallpaper peeling in jagged strips, the smell of mildew and rot suffocating the air. Her breath hitched as she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the warped floorboards. The door groaned shut behind her, sealing her in. For a moment, everything was silent. She held her breath, listening. No whispers, no footsteps, just the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. Then the floorboards creaked. Emily spun around, her eyes darting across the dimly lit foyer. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, shifting like smoke. She took a step back, her pulse hammering in her ears. The locket pulsed in her bag, each beat syncing with her heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. The whisper came softly at first, like a lover's breath against her ear. "You never should have left." Her body recoiled, but the sound was already inside her. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the whispers continued, slithering through her skull. The walls groaned, the house breathing around her as if waking from a long sleep. She stumbled backward, her shoulder hitting the wall. Her bag fell from her hands, and the locket tumbled out, landing on the floor with a metallic thud. Its glow intensified, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. "Why won't you die?" she screamed, tears blurring her vision. The floor beneath her feet trembled, cracks spidering across the wood like veins spreading from a diseased heart. The shadows twisted, forming shapes, faces with hollow eyes and mouths stretched wide in silent screams. She grabbed the locket, its heat scorching her palm, and bolted up the staircase. The whispers chased her, growing louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. Her vision swam as she reached the second floor, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted toward the master bedroom. The door swung open on its own. Inside, the room was cold and damp, the smell of decay stronger than ever. The bed, once covered in dust and mildew, was now pristine, its sheets pulled tight as if freshly made. The mirror above the dresser reflected nothing but darkness. The locket pulsed violently in her hand. "You want me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Then take me." She hurled the locket at the mirror. The glass shattered, shards raining down like frozen raindrops. For a moment, the world stood still. Then the floor buckled. The shadows screamed as the walls cracked and groaned, the house collapsing inward like a dying animal. Emily fell to her knees, her hands covering her head as debris rained down around her. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and the whispers grew fainter, fading into the distance. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was the glow of the locket, flickering one final time like the dying breath of a star. And then, silence. The curse reborn. Emily awoke to the taste of blood on her tongue and the smell of smoke thick in her nostrils. Her head throbbed, and the world swam in and out of focus as she blinked against the debris-dusted air. She was lying on her back, surrounded by fragments of shattered wood and crumbling plaster. The faint glow of dawn filtered through the cracked remains of Swallow Hill Manor, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she pushed herself upright. Her arms ached, her muscles screaming in protest, but she forced herself to move. The house groaned around her, as though it were alive and suffering in its final moments. Is it over? Did I win? Her gaze darted across the wreckage. Pieces of the grand staircase lay scattered like broken ribs. The walls, once covered in peeling wallpaper, were now cracked open, revealing rotting beams beneath. The air was damp and heavy, and the scent of decay clung to her skin like a curse that refused to be washed away. Then she saw it. The locket. It lay in the middle of the floor, glowing faintly amid the wreckage as if mocking her. Its surface was cracked, the intricate pattern scorched and blackened, but it hadn't been destroyed. Not fully. Her stomach twisted, bile rising in her throat as she crawled toward it. The whispers were gone, at least for now, but the sight of the locket filled her with a dread so profound that it rooted her to the spot. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the cursed object. Don't touch it. Her mind screamed the warning, but her body refused to listen. Her hand trembled as she brushed her fingertips against the cold metal. Pain exploded up her arm, sharp and electric as if she had touched a live wire. She yanked her hand back with a gasp, cradling it against her chest. The locket pulsed once, twice, then went still, its glow fading to a dim ember. It's not over. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't destroyed the curse. She had only wounded it. The house was dying, yes, but the thing that lived within it was still tethered to her, hiding in the cracks of her mind like a parasite waiting for its next breath. She scrambled to her feet, swaying as the floor buckled beneath her. The ground felt unsteady, as if the house were collapsing into itself, pulling its secrets down into the earth. She needed to get out before it buried her alive. Emily staggered down the crumbling hallway, her boots slipping on the dust-covered floor. The walls groaned, and chunks of plaster rained down around her. She didn't dare look back. The house had a way of trapping its victims when they hesitated, and she wasn't about to give it the chance. The front door was just ahead, hanging off its hinges. Beyond it, the gray light of dawn filtered through the mist-covered trees. Freedom. Her lungs burned as she sprinted toward the exit. She jumped over a fallen beam and burst through the doorway, the cool morning air hitting her like a slap to the face. She stumbled down the front steps, nearly collapsing as her boots sank into the mud. Behind her, the house let out a final guttural groan, and the roof caved in with a deafening crash. Emily collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. Her hands shook violently, her fingers clawing at the wet ground as tears streamed down her face. She had escaped. Again. But the victory felt hollow, like she had merely delayed the inevitable. The locket pulsed faintly in her bag, reminding her that it wasn't over. It would never be over. Her sobs echoed through the clearing, mixing with the sound of rain dripping from the trees. She wanted to believe that if she stayed here long enough, the forest would swallow her whole, and she would disappear into the earth. But she knew better. The curse wouldn't let her rest. It's not tied to the house anymore, she thought bitterly. It's tied to me. A familiar warning. The distant sound of a car engine broke through her spiraling thoughts. Her head snapped up, her breath hitching. At the edge of the clearing, a car approached slowly, its headlights cutting through the fog like twin beacons. Emily's muscles tensed as she rose to her feet, her eyes narrowing. Who would be here now? The car rolled to a stop, and the driver's side door creaked open. A man stepped out, his rain-soaked jacket clinging to his frame. His face was partially obscured by the mist, but as he approached, Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was Ryan. Her throat tightened. No, that's impossible. Ryan had been twisted, corrupted by the curse the last time she saw him. She had left him screaming in the woods, his eyes black pits dripping with ichor. He couldn't be here. He shouldn't be here. Emily, he said, his voice soft and familiar. Too familiar. She backed away, shaking her head violently. You're not real. He stepped closer, his boots squelching in the mud. It's me, he insisted, holding up his hands as if to show he meant no harm. His eyes were normal now, their hazel color warm and human. I'm not the same as I was before. I fought it, Emily. I fought it off. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. No, I don't believe you. I know you don't, he said, lowering his hands. But you need to listen to me. The locket, it's not just cursed, it's alive, and it's feeding off you. Her stomach churned. I know, she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. I can feel it. Ryan took another cautious step forward. Then you know what you have to do. I tried, she said, her voice cracking. I burned it, I destroyed the house, but it didn't work. He shook his head. Because you didn't destroy the source. Her knees nearly buckled. The source? Ryan pointed to the bag hanging from her shoulder. The locket is a tether, but it's not the heart of the curse. The heart is buried deeper, beneath the earth where they buried her. Her mind reeled. Martha Holloway, the woman accused of witchcraft, executed on the land where Sallow Hill was built. Emily had read her name in the archives, but she hadn't understood the full extent of her connection to the curse. They buried her body under the tree, Ryan continued, his voice urgent. The same tree where they hung her. That's where the curse began. Emily's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Her breath came in rapid bursts as her mind raced. She had come so close to escaping, but the curse had dragged her back again and again. And now, she finally understood why. The locket wasn't the ending. It was the beginning. Burn her bones, Ryan said. End her suffering, and you end the curse. Emily swallowed hard, her gaze shifting toward the tree line. The oak tree loomed in the distance, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like the twisted arms of a forgotten god. The ground beneath it pulsed faintly as if the earth itself were breathing. Her fingers brushed against the locket through the fabric of her bag. It was cold now, lifeless, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The curse had a way of fighting back. She met Ryan's gaze, her jaw set in determination. Then let's finish this, he nodded. No more running. Together they headed toward the tree, the wind howling through the forest like a warning. The locket thumped faintly against her side, each beat echoing the steady rhythm of her heart. But this time, she wouldn't let it win. This time, she would bury the curse for good. The living curse. The rain fell in sheets, each droplet slicing through the cold night air as if the storm itself were alive and angry. Emily trudged through the forest, her boots sinking into the mud with every step. The branches above groaned beneath the weight of the wind, their skeletal limbs scraping together like bones in a crypt. The locket pulsed faintly against her hip, a steady beat that seemed to match her quickening heart. Ryan walked ahead of her, his flashlight cutting through the fog. The beam danced across the trees, illuminating their twisted trunks and the moss-covered ground. The oak tree lay ahead, barely visible through the dense mist, its gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Are you sure it's here? Emily's voice trembled, but she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the fear that was threatening to drown her. Ryan nodded without turning back. His shoulders were tense, and his breathing was heavy. It's here. The tree is where they buried her. That's why the land is cursed. It's where it started. Emily tightened her grip on her bag, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the shovel inside. She had taken it from her trunk, the same shovel she had used earlier to dig up her uncle's journal and the jar of black ichor at the cemetery. Now it felt heavier, as though the weight of what she was about to do had already seeped into the iron. Her gaze flicked to Ryan, who moved with purpose, but something about him felt off. He hadn't spoken much since the car ride, and when he did, his words felt distant, mechanical, like he was reading from a script he didn't fully believe. She wanted to trust him. After all, he had come back to help her. But doubt coiled around her chest, like a snake tightening its grip. The locket thumped again, and she winced, pressing her palm against it through her coat. It felt like a second heart, one that didn't belong to her, trying to beat its way out. "We're close," Ryan said, his breath fogging in the cold air. He stopped at the base of the tree and shone his flashlight upward, tracing the thick branches that twisted and tangled like veins in an ancient corpse. "This is it?" Emily's stomach churned. The oak tree's trunk was massive, its bark cracked and weathered like the skin of something that had been left to rot. Moss covered the roots, which coiled around the base like snakes burrowing into the ground. The air here was different, colder, heavier, and filled with a metallic scent that clung to the back of her throat. She dropped her bag and pulled out the shovel, the metal glinting faintly in the pale light. Her fingers ached as she gripped it, the cold seeping into her bones. "How do you know it's here?" she asked, glancing at Ryan. He didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the tree, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Because the land remembers. It always remembers." Emily shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of those words. She bent down and drove the shovel into the wet earth. The soil was dense and heavy, resisting her efforts with every push. Mud clung to the blade, making each lift harder than the last. But she didn't stop. Her breath came in labored gasps, mixing with the sound of the rain and the distant rustling of the trees. Ryan crouched next to her, using his hands to claw away at the dirt when the shovel couldn't cut deep enough. His fingers were caked in mud, but he didn't seem to notice. His focus was entirely on the ground beneath them. After what felt like an eternity, the shovel hit something solid. Emily froze. Her breath hitched as she dropped to her knees and scraped away the remaining dirt with her hands. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against wood. An old, splintered coffin buried just beneath the surface. Ryan leaned closer, wiping mud from his face. "That's it. Open it." She hesitated. The locket pulsed violently now, as if sensing its connection to what lay beneath. Her entire body screamed at her to run, to leave the coffin buried and forget this ever happened. But she knew better. The curse would never let her go unless she ended it here. Taking a deep breath, she jammed the tip of the shovel into the seam of the coffin's lid and pried it open. The wood groaned, splitting apart like a mouth opening to release a long-held secret. The smell hit her first, thick and putrid, like decaying meat left to rot in stagnant water. She gagged, covering her mouth with her hand as she fought back the urge to vomit. The inside of the coffin was damp, the wood blackened with rot, and there, lying in the center, was the body of Martha Holloway. Or what was left of it. The bones were twisted, their surfaces stained dark with dirt and time. Scraps of fabric clung to the skeleton, and strands of matted hair framed the skull, which grinned up at Emily as if mocking her. But it was the thing clutched in the bony fingers that made her stomach lurch. A second locket, identical to the one she carried, except this one was cracked down the center, oozing black ichor. Her fingers shook as she reached for the locket, the bile rising in her throat. As soon as her skin brushed against the metal, the whispers returned, louder and more desperate than ever. "You can't destroy her. She's already inside you." Emily staggered back, clutching her head as the voices clawed at her mind. The ground beneath her trembled, as though the earth itself were rejecting what she was about to do. The wind howled through the trees, and the shadows around her writhed like snakes ready to strike. "Emily!" Ryan's voice cut through the chaos. "You have to burn it. Now." She fumbled with her bag, pulling out the can of lighter fluid and a box of matches. Her hands were slick with mud and sweat, making it nearly impossible to hold on to them. The locket pulsed violently, sending shockwaves up her arm. But she gritted her teeth and poured the fluid over the coffin and its contents. The smell of chemicals mixed with the stench of decay, creating a nauseating cocktail that made her head spin. Ryan crouched beside her, his hand on her shoulder. This is it. Once you light it, there's no going back. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. She struck the match. The tiny flame flickered, struggling against the rain, but she shielded it with her hand and dropped it into the coffin. The fire roared to life, consuming the wood and bones in a flash of orange and red. Black smoke billowed upward, carrying the scent of burning flesh and rot. The shadows around them shrieked, their screams mingling with the howling wind. The locket in her hand grew hotter, burning her palm, but she refused to let go. She held it tightly, watching as the flames devoured the second locket within the coffin. The whispers grew fainter, their voices turning into desperate wails before fading into silence. The ground beneath them shook violently, cracks spidering through the earth as if the land itself were trying to swallow them whole. Ryan grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. We have to go. Emily stumbled after him, her legs barely supporting her weight as they sprinted through the forest. Behind them, the oak tree groaned, its branches splitting and collapsing in on themselves as the fire spread. The air was thick with smoke, choking her lungs as she ran. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the forest. Emily collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Her hands were blistered, her skin covered in mud and ash, but she didn't care. The locket lay cold and lifeless in her palm, its glow finally extinguished. Ryan knelt beside her, his breath ragged. It's over, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. You did it. Emily stared at the locket, her fingers trembling. The silence around them was deafening, but for the first time in months, it felt real. No whispers, no shadows, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But as she sat there, tears streaming down her face, a faint thought crept into her mind. Was it really over? She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. But somewhere, deep in the back of her mind, the doubt remained. Because curses like this don't die easily. And neither do the dead. Shadows in the blood. The sky was streaked with the pale pink and gray hues of dawn as Emily drove back toward town, her fingers gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. The rain had stopped, but her windshield wipers still dragged back and forth, smearing streaks of water across the glass. The world outside was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that settles after a storm, but feels more like a warning than a relief. Her clothes were soaked through with sweat, mud, and ash, sticking to her skin like a second, suffocating layer. Her hands trembled as she rubbed them against her jeans, trying to stop the shaking. The locket lay cold and silent in her bag, nestled between the torn fabric and the shovel she hadn't bothered to clean. Ryan's words echoed in her head. It's over. You did it. But as the car bumped along the winding road, weaving between rows of trees, Emily couldn't shake the hollow feeling inside her chest. The curse was supposed to be broken. The locket was supposed to be powerless now, nothing more than a meaningless trinket. And yet, every time she glanced toward the passenger seat, she swore she could feel it watching her. Her phone buzzed from the cup holder, jolting her from her thoughts. Her stomach clenched as she glanced down, half expecting another message from the unknown number. But it wasn't a text. One missed call. Mom. The breath she had been holding escaped in a shaky exhale. She hadn't spoken to her mother in weeks, not since the whispers had consumed her life, and she had become too afraid to drag anyone else into the nightmare. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating. Finally, she pressed the button to call back. The line rang twice before her mother's familiar voice answered. "Emily." Her mother's voice cracked with relief. "I've been worried sick. Where have you been?" Emily swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "I'm okay, Mom. I'm sorry for disappearing. I've just had a lot going on." "You sound exhausted. Are you sure you're okay?" Her throat tightened. "I think so," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. "I'm heading home now." "Good. Come home. You can rest here." Home. The word felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else's life. But Emily nodded, even though her mother couldn't see her. "I'll be there soon." After they hung up, she sat in silence, gripping the phone tightly in her hand. Home sounded nice, but the thought of it also filled her with dread. What if she wasn't free of the curse? What if she brought it with her? The trees thinned as she approached the outskirts of town. She could see the rooftops of familiar houses peeking through the mist, their chimneys puffing faint columns of smoke into the cool morning air. The sight should have comforted her, but instead, it made her skin crawl. The locket pulsed once. Emily flinched, her eyes snapping to the bag on the passenger seat. The sensation was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Her pulse quickened as she pulled the car to the side of the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "You're supposed to be dead." Her breath came in short gasps as she yanked the bag open and pulled out the locket. It felt like ice in her palm, its once glowing surface now dull and cracked. But as she stared at it, the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She could feel something squirming beneath the metal, like a heartbeat trapped inside. Her phone buzzed again, making her jump. She looked down and saw a new message on the screen. "Unknown number. You didn't kill it." Emily's hands trembled and the phone slipped from her grasp, landing on the floor. Her chest heaved as she tried to process the words. No, this couldn't be happening. She had burned the body. She had watched the flames consume the bones, heard the whispers fade into nothingness. "It's over," she said aloud, as if saying it would make it true. But her voice cracked, betraying her. The locket pulsed again. This time, it didn't stop. Emily slammed her hand against the steering wheel, tears streaming down her face. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, and for what? To be dragged back into the same nightmare she thought she had escaped? Her sobs filled the car, raw and broken, but there was no one to hear them. The air around her grew colder, and her breath fogged the glass. The smell of damp earth and decay seeped into the car, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She wiped her eyes and looked up, her gaze locking on the rearview mirror. A shadow moved behind her. She whipped her head around, but the back seat was empty. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stared to the darkness beyond the trees. The mist shifted, curling like smoke, and for a moment she swore she saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It didn't move. It just watched. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her attention back. Unknown number. The locket isn't the curse. You are. The words stabbed into her like knives. Her fingers curled around the locket, squeezing it so tightly that the edges bit into her palm. She could feel the shadows closing in around her, crawling through the cracks in her mind. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, I'm not cursed. I destroyed it." The wind howled through the trees, rattling the branches like skeletal fingers tapping against glass. The figure in the distance took a step closer, its outline barely visible through the fog. Emily's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She needed to get away. She needed to run. She shoved the locket back into the bag and threw the car into gear, tires skidding as she sped down the road. The trees blurred past her, their twisted shapes stretching like claws trying to pull her back. She gritted her teeth, refusing to look in the rearview mirror again. But the whispers followed her. They slithered through the air vents, curled around her ears and sank into her mind like poison. You didn't bury it deep enough. You brought it with you. Her vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. The weight of the locket felt heavier now, like it was growing, expanding, consuming her from the inside. She could feel it in her veins, in the marrow of her bones, feeding off her fear. "I won't let you win," she screamed, slamming her fists against the steering wheel. "I won't." But the whispers only laughed. "We don't have to win. We've already taken root." By the time Emily reached her apartment complex, the sun had fully risen, casting pale light over the damp pavement. Her body felt like it was running on fumes, her muscles aching and her head pounding. She stumbled out of the car, the locket pressing against her side like a knife as she clutched her bag and made her way up the stairs. The key trembled in her hand as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was silent, the air stale from being closed off for so long. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her chest heaving. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she was safe. She dropped the bag onto the floor and sank to her knees, covering her face with her hands. The silence was suffocating, but at least it wasn't filled with whispers, until the tapping began. Her head shot up, her breath hitching. The sound was soft at first, like knuckles rapping gently against a wooden surface, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the walls. "No," she whimpered, backing away from the door. "No, please." The tapping turned into banging, and the whispers returned, louder and more vicious than before. "You can't run. You'll never run far enough." The mirror on the wall cracked, a jagged split running down its center. Emily scrambled to her feet, her mind spinning as she tried to figure out what to do. Her hands fumbled with the bag, pulling out the locket. Its surface was cold, but she could feel the heat building beneath it, like something about to burst free. Her fingers tightened around it as the banging in the walls grew deafening. The air grew colder, and frost crept across the windows, turning them opaque. The whispers coiled around her like snakes. "Let me out, Emily. Let me out." Her reflection in the cracked mirror smiled, even though she wasn't smiling. Its eyes were black pits, and black ichor dripped from its mouth, staining the floor. The reflection mouthed the words that the whispers had been chanting all along. "You are the curse now." Emily screamed, throwing the locket across the room. It hit the wall with a metallic clang and fell to the floor. But the whispers didn't stop. The shadows writhed, stretching across the ceiling like veins spreading through a body. The tapping stopped. The banging stopped. The apartment fell silent. But the silence was worse than the noise. Emily sank to the floor, her fingers tangled in her hair as she sobbed. The whispers had won. She wasn't free. She would never be free. The curse hadn't died with the house or the bones. It had taken root in her blood, in her mind, and it wasn't letting go. The locket sat in the corner of the room, its glow faint but persistent, like a heartbeat waiting to restart. And as Emily sat there, trembling and broken, the last whisper slid into her ear like a blade. "We're home now."
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss our next video. Your support helps us keep this channel alive and kicking. See you in the next one.